Hi everyone, and welcome back to the E3SM Biogeochemistry webinar. Today's speaker is Gabe Kooperman from the University of Georgia, and he's going to speak on a topic that I think is of pretty broad interest because it crosses multiple aspects of the biogeochemical cycles in the climate system and also the water cycle. So I'll hand it over to Gabe to introduce his talk.
Thanks. Thanks for the introduction and for the opportunity to give this talk today. Yeah, so again, I'm Gabe Kooperman from the University of Georgia. If you can't hear me at all, please stop and let me know. But today I'm going to talk about a collection of work I've been involved in looking at carbon-water cycle interactions in global Earth system models and trying to understand how plant physiological responses to rising CO2 contribute to changes in the water cycle and climate extremes in the tropics. And this is work I've been doing with colleagues at Oak Ridge National Lab, at the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, at the National Center for Atmospheric Research, University of Washington, and at UC Irvine. And in particular, I wanted to acknowledge Megan Fowler, who recently defended her PhD at UC Irvine, and who contributed to and led some of the work that I'm going to present today. So this talk is really focused on this question at the top of this slide about how plant physiological responses to rising CO2 impact the water cycle and climate extremes in the tropics. Over the last 200 years, there's been a significant increase in the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere as a result of industrialization, use of fossil fuels, and human development of the land. And that's likely to continue sort of rapidly as we move into the 21st century due to continued reliance on fossil fuels and population growth. And CO2 being a strong greenhouse gas contributes to global scale warming and driving changes in the climate system and extreme events like increases in severe storms and flooding and heat waves that have impacts on society as well as natural ecosystems. But natural ecosystems aren't sort of responding passively to these anthropogenically forced changes. They're an integral part of how the climate system evolves over time in response to rising levels of CO2. And there's been a growing body of evidence showing vegetation effects on the surface energy and water budgets can interact with circulation in ways that influence large-scale patterns of precipitation. Increases in CO2 can affect transpiration rates and water use efficiency in ways that can leave more moisture in the soil column, leading to increases in soil moisture in some cases that can affect runoff and have flooding impacts. In other cases, CO2 fertilization can lead to increases in leaf area and plant growth that leads to more transpiration and more water being removed from the soil column that can contribute to drought conditions. And there's even evidence that changes in the sort of partitioning of energy at the surface from latent heating to sensible heating can influence temperature extremes as well as forest fire activity. And so today I'm sort of going to briefly touch on all of these aspects of the climate system, but primarily focusing on how plants influence patterns of precipitation change on large scales, how they influence runoff, and what the implications are for flooding. And I wanted to sort of start off with a picture of projections from CMIPS 5, RCP 8.5 scenario, looking at changes in flooding in the future. In the last few years, there's been a number of global scale flood risk assessments that are based on output from Earth system models. And this is an example of one where runoff has been downscaled using the CaMa-Flood model to represent river routing and floodplain inundation. And it shows the change in what is currently a 100-year flooding event at the end of the 21st century. And so what's shown in the dark and light blue colors that you see across much of the tropics is about a 25 to 50-year return period. And this indicates that flooding events that occur every 100 years in the present day may occur about 4 times or up to 4 times more frequently in the future. This type of assessment is often called a model cascade, and it relies on offline downscaling. And it starts with fairly low resolution global scale Earth system model output, usually 1 or 2 degree resolution. For the land surface, that might be runoff. And for atmospheric output, it could be a combination of precipitation, temperature, and potential evapotranspiration. And this is downscaled using high resolution global hydrological or river routing models. In the example I showed on the previous slide, that was downscaled at 1/4 degree resolution. Today, resolution is even higher to calculate river discharge and inundated area at higher spatial resolution. And that can be combined with local scale physical downscaling to represent flood probabilities. It can be combined with population growth and socioeconomic models and infrastructure models to ultimately try to get to an estimate of global scale flood risk assessments and flood impact that include the total number of people that could be exposed to flooding in the future, the number of assets that could be exposed, and the total number of damages. This sort of model cascade ultimately, though, is driven by the changes that are stimulated within the global Earth system model itself. And so that's what I've been sort of interested in trying to understand, and in particular, looking at how the use of sort of atmospheric-centric output like precipitation and temperature differs from the use of runoff, where interactions between the land surface and the response of the land surface to increasing levels of carbon dioxide are represented sort of interactively within the Earth system model before this progression of downscaling occurs. And this type of approach has been necessary in CMIPS 5 error models. With newer models in E3SM with MOSART-Inundation, this sort of interaction between the land surface and high resolution river routing and inundation may be represented more realistically online. But in a lot of the assessments that have been done previously, especially those using precipitation and atmospheric centric data, the changes in the land surface are not actually included in the flood projections. So to start, I want to sort of just review some of the ways we expect the climate system to change in ways that can influence runoff and flooding, starting with just some sort of simplified schematics that illustrate a few of the important processes. And so what's shown in this first figure is an increase in precipitation intensity. With higher levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, we expect warming that'll lead to more humidity in the atmosphere. And if the dynamics of convective events doesn't change much, then we can expect more moisture to be lifted up into clouds and into storms during extreme storm events, leading to more precipitation that falls at higher rates. So less is intercepted by a vegetation canopy, more reaches the ground at higher rates, so less can infiltrate into the soil, and that could lead to more surface runoff. We also expect changes in the mean patterns of precipitation, with some places receiving more rainfall, some places receiving less rainfall. This could be due to expansions of the tropics or shifts in the storm tracks. In places that receive more rainfall, that could lead to higher soil moisture and higher water table depths, so that even if the intensity of precipitation doesn't change, the ground itself may be closer to saturation when it does rain, leading to less infiltration and more surface and subsurface runoff. Other places might receive less rainfall, and all areas on land are expected to warm in response to radiatively driven climate change, which could lead to more evaporative demand, both of which could dry the soil column, leading to reductions in surface and subsurface runoff. But in addition to the direct effect, radiative effects of rising CO2, plants are also sort of responding to increasing levels of CO2 by reducing stomatal conductance and CO2 fertilization effects on transpiration. At the leaf level, plants open up their stomata in order to take in CO2 during photosynthesis, and moisture is allowed to escape and evaporate through transpiration. And because vegetation can reach the water that's deep underground at the root level, This can account for the majority of evaporation on land relative to other components of evaporation, like evaporation out of the soil. And in tropical forest regions in particular, it can account for up to 70% of the total ET at the surface. And because that water that evaporates at the surface goes into the atmosphere and can form clouds and precipitation again that can rain back down into the surface and infiltrate into the ground, in tropical forest regions, there can be considerable sort of rainfall recycling that vegetation contributes to, up to 35% on average. And this is something that CMIP5 era land surface models have been able to start to capture the magnitude of more realistically. And so this is an example from the community or system model showing the percent of transpiration to total evapotranspiration around the world. And when we increase the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere, the stomata don't have to open up as much in order to get the CO2 in during photosynthesis, so transpiration declines. And that's something we see in CESM in response to really elevated levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, significant reductions in transpiration rates. And this is difficult to observe, but there are some proxy evidence that this has already happened over the 20th century in increases in runoff and proxy evidence through tree ring growth. And there have been some direct experiments through the free air CO2 enrichment studies to try to measure this in real time, although most of those have been focused on the mid-latitudes and not in the tropics. But there is some evidence that this is occurring, although, again, in the mid-latitudes, it may be partially offset by increased leaf area growth, especially in young forests, leading to more stomata and potentially more transpiration. And so in regions where stomatal conductance is the dominant effect, you might expect reductions in transpiration that could leave more water in the soil column. And so again, even if the rainfall rates remain the same, when it rains, if the ground is closer to saturation, that may lead to less infiltration and more surface and subsurface runoff. In other places where CO2 fertilization effects draw more moisture out of the ground and leave the ground drier, that could lead to less surface runoff. And that's something we see outside of the tropics in the mid-latitudes, like the western part of the United States and Western Europe. In addition to these direct effects of plants on the amount of water that stays in the soil column, there are also feedbacks from changes in transpiration and soil moisture on mean precipitation in the atmosphere, where there's a shift from latent heating to sensible heating that can influence circulation patterns, that influence moisture convergence patterns that lead to increases in precipitation in some regions and decreases in precipitation in other regions. And that's really what I want to start talking about some of my work today, and then I'll get into changes in soil moisture and runoff and flooding effects next. So this figure shows the change in precipitation at the end of the 21st century under the high emissions RCP 8.5 scenario. This is a multi-model mean where we have about 40 different climate models going into this multi-model mean change. And if you focus on tropical forest regions, you see large changes on the order of 1 millimeter per day increases in islands with tropical forests in Asia, like Indonesia, Malaysia, and Papua New Guinea. You see slightly smaller increases in Central Africa, and you see decreases on the same order of magnitude in the Amazon. And before I sort of start talking about these future changes that are mostly driven by greenhouse gas forcing, in light of sort of the current news and discussion of forest fires in the Amazon, I wanted to sort of contrast this future change in precipitation with the changes that are simulated over the 20th century. And that's what's shown here. This is focusing on just 10 of the CMIP5 climate models that included more interactive aerosol cloud physics, where here we're seeing an opposite pattern of change in many places with decreases in precipitation over much of the tropics, especially over tropical forest regions in Asia, a little bit to some degree in Central Africa, and in South America, there's this decrease over the Amazon or over the Andes, which is opposite to what you see in the future simulations here. And using the CESM large ensemble, we can look at which forcing factors have contributed to these precipitation changes over the 20th century, where the contribution from greenhouse gases can be separated using exclusion experiments where greenhouse gas increases have been neglected, as well as anthropogenic aerosol, biomass burning aerosol, and changes in land cover and land use. And here you can see that it's really the aerosol forcing in the 20th century that's leading to a lot of these changes, especially in Asia, that are opposite to what you see with greenhouse gases. And if you focus on tropical forest regions in particular, it's really the biomass burning or forest fire aerosol emissions, or downwind of where forest fire aerosol emissions are occurring in the case of the Andes, that are really controlling the precipitation change and leading to a sign of precipitation change that's opposite to what we see in the future as the greenhouse gas driven changes become the dominant effect. And so I think as more models in CMIPS 6 include interactive aerosol and aerosol effects on cloud microphysics and precipitation, and also as there's a growing interest in looking at near-term climate change as well as long-term climate change, I think these effects might be worth keeping in mind as well. But today I'm going to talk about sort of the long-term 21st century changes and in response to CO2 increases in particular. And what I didn't mention when we looked at this figure earlier is the stippling that you see here shows where the models agree on the sign of the precipitation change. And if you look at the tropical forest regions, you see very little stippling. So despite the fact that there are really large changes in the multimodal mean, there are a lot of models that disagree on even the sign of the precipitation change at the level of individual forests. And so what we've done in some of my work is look at not just individual forest levels, but sort of consider this zonal pattern of precipitation change that you see across the tropics as a whole. And that's sort of comparing the relative increases in rainfall over Asia and the maritime continent and Central Africa to the relative decreases in precipitation that you see over the Amazon and South and Central America. And we've quantified this pattern of precipitation change across the tropics using a sort of simple asymmetry index. We've looked at the average precipitation in tropical forest regions, which are shown in green here, in Central Africa and in Asia, minus the average precipitation in Central and South America. And you can calculate this for the present climate, and you can calculate this for the future climate and see how this zonal asymmetry changes over time. And that's what's shown in this figure on the right-hand side now, with the left side being the present day values and the right side being future values from all of the climate models that went into the multi-model mean I showed previously. And here you see for present day values, there's significant spread across the models. Some models have negative values, some models have positive values. But there's this really robust response where all of the models are shifting towards more positive values in response to climate change. And that could mean that there's a decrease over the Amazon in a model and an increase in Asian tropical forests. Or it could be an increase in both places, but the increase is larger in Asia, or it could be a decrease in both places, but the decrease is larger in the Amazon. But in all cases, there's this really strong signal of growing zonal tropical precipitation asymmetry across these continents. And so in this study, we were trying to understand what was causing these changes and why is it different in different tropical forest regions. And so the first thing we wanted to do was sort of simplify the simulation experiment design. RCP 8.5 includes not just CO2 concentration, but also other greenhouse gases, as well as land use change and aerosol emissions. And so we wanted to first see if we had the same pattern of change when you just have a simple CO2 only forcing. And so that's what's shown in this in this figure on the right, this is the change in precipitation in simulations that started with pre-industrial CO2 and then increased up to 4 times CO2 at 1% per year over a 140-year period. 8 models contributed simulations like this in CMIPS-5, and you see the same pattern of change. You see strong reductions in precipitation over the Amazon, increases over Central Africa, and increases over Asia, as well as an increase over the Andes. And the nice thing about having a CO2 only forcing is we can separate out sort of those radiative greenhouse effects, increasing the intensity of precipitation and shifting patterns of precipitation that I talked about earlier, from the plant physiological effects of rising CO2. And this is done as part of the C4MIP, CMIP-5 experiment, and sort of takes advantage of the fact that there are different components of Earth system models that are coupled together, and we can separately control the concentration of CO2 going into the atmospheric model. And this is example, this is from the Community Earth System model, where we're controlling the concentration of CO2 in CAM relative to the concentration of CO2 in the land model in CLM. And so I'm going to show you results that compare 4 simulations: a pre-industrial control simulation where CO2 was held constant in both the land surface and the atmosphere, a simulation that I call the full simulation, where CO2 has increased up to 4 times pre-industrial values in both the atmosphere and in the land surface, a physiological simulation where I've held the CO2 constant in the atmosphere, so there's no increased radiative greenhouse effects, but it's increased in the land surface, and a radiation simulation where it's increased in the atmosphere, but it's held constant in the land surface. And it turns out that both of these land surface and atmospheric forcings contribute to this zonal asymmetry pattern we see in the full simulation, where they both lead to increases in rainfall in Asia, especially these islands, the maritime continent, and decreases in rainfall in the Amazon. And if you look particularly at really dense forests in the Amazon and in Asia, the physiological forcing is contributing more than the radiation forcing to the precipitation changes that we see there. And so that's really what I've been trying to understand, is why do these 2 tropical forest regions, in response to the same CO2 forcing, have a different precipitation change? And so I'm going to show you results from the global physiological simulation. And as you might expect, increasing levels of CO2 in the atmosphere lead to reductions in stomatal conductance that reduce transpiration and project onto total evapotranspiration. So we see large reductions in evapotranspiration on land that sort of cut off a source of moisture to the atmosphere and a source of moisture for precipitation. They also affect the surface energy budget by shifting from latent heating to sensible heating and more warming. We have a mirror image in the sensible heat fluxes, where there's increases in sensible heating and warming in all these places where transpiration has decreased. And that leads to near surface conditions that are drier and warmer. And that can act to sort of suppress convection by increasing the height of the boundary layer and the level of condensation and the level where convection will begin freely. But this is happening in the same direction in both of these regions. In both places, there's a reduction of evapotranspiration, and there's this drying and warming conditions at the surface. So that doesn't really explain the differences that we see. But we can start to see what's happening by looking further above the surface at the humidity field. And first, I'm just showing you the near surface specific humidity fields here in the upper right, which mostly reflect this reduction in evapotranspiration, leading to reductions in near surface specific humidity over most tropical land. But if you look higher up above the surface at the changes in the upper atmosphere, we see places where humidity has increased that are co-located with places where precipitation has increased. And so this figure in the bottom right-hand corner now is showing a cross-section average between 5 south and 5 north across the tropics. The y-axis is height, the x-axis is longitude, And you see large increases in specific humidity over all of the places where precipitation has increased. So increases over Central Africa and Indonesia, Malaysia, and Papua New Guinea, and increases over the Andes. And for Asia and Africa, that upper level increase in humidity is co-located with the near surface reduction in humidity. But in South America, the upper level increase is offset to the west over the Andes relative to the near surface decrease over the Amazon. And that sort of pattern results from the circulation changes that are driven by the physiological forcing. And so now I've overlaid in the top upper right-hand corner the 850 millibar wind field change, and in the bottom the zonal and vertical wind field changes. And what you see over these islands in Asia is island-like circulation effect, where there's sort of low-level inflow, bringing more moist air from the surrounding oceans onto these islands, and that's being lifted up as air rises above the islands. In Africa and in South America, there's more of a sort of classic convectively coupled dynamical response, where you have strong uplift in the region where there's convective heating that's centered on the equator. In this case, it's the same as the region where there's increased precipitation and humidity. There's strong low-level inflow off to the west, and so that's coming into the Andes in the case of South America, and it's coming off the Atlantic Ocean into Africa in that case. And there's weak subsidence off to the east. And in Africa, that weak subsidence is happening over on the eastern side of the continent and over the ocean. But in South America, the subsidence is occurring directly over the Amazon. And so that contributes to reducing convection and rainfall there, in addition to the reduction in local evapotranspiration. And so what we were wondering is if this large-scale circulation response is part of a tropics-wide mechanism, like enhancement of the Walker circulation, or if these circulation changes that are occurring over each of these continents are occurring sort of in isolation of one another. And so we designed another set of experiments using the community air system model, where we held the CO2 constant in the atmosphere again, and only increased it in the land surface, just like the physiological simulation I showed previously. But here, the increase in CO2 has been isolated to individual continents. So on the left-hand side, CO2 has increased globally up to 4 times pre-industrial values over all land surfaces. In the America simulation, it's held fixed at pre-industrial values over most land surfaces and only increases over Central and South America. And the same thing over Central Africa, and the same thing over Asia. And we find that most of the precipitation change we see in the globally forced simulation is captured locally in these regionally forced simulations. So this dipole pattern of increasing rainfall over the Andes and decreasing rainfall over the Amazon is captured mostly in the America forced simulation. Increases over Central Africa and increases over Asia are both captured in the forcings applied regionally over each of these individual continents. And the only place where we see a strong sort of non-local influence is this reduction in rainfall, widespread reduction in rainfall over the Amazon and over South America that's associated with the forcing that's been applied over Africa. And these patterns of precipitation change are again being driven by dynamic responses in the atmosphere, changing patterns of moisture in the atmosphere that are also captured locally. And so they're operating sort of in isolation over individual continents and not really connected across the tropics. Where in the Asia simulation, where CO2 has only been increased over the Asian continent, we see this island-like circulation bringing warm, moist air from the surrounding ocean waters onto these islands, leading to increases in precipitation and upper-level humidity there. And we see these dynamic, convectively coupled circulation responses over South America and over Africa. And in the case of Africa, that strong low-level eastward flow extends all the way across the Atlantic Ocean and reduces the mean flow of moisture that's usually flowing from the Atlantic onto the Amazon. So that's what's contributing to this reduction in precipitation that we see over the Amazon. And we can sort of quantify these effects by looking at the column moisture budget in each of these regions. And here I'm just focusing on the Amazon specifically and those islands in Indonesia, Malaysia, and Papua New Guinea, where the changes in precipitation are quantified as contributions from changes in evaporation and changes in moisture convergence. And so here we see, again, large reductions in the globally forced simulations in green in the Amazon that have contributions from both local forcing over Central and South America and the forcing over Africa. And we have large increases in precipitation over Indonesia that are mostly captured in the locally forced simulation. In both regions, there's a local response to higher CO2 that reduces evaporation. But in Indonesia, changes in moisture convergence are much larger than a local evaporation reduction, leading to increases in precipitation there. While over the Amazon, there's this reduction in moisture convergence associated with Africa that contributes to a further reduction in precipitation in the global simulation. And what's interesting about the effects of Africa on South America is that that's part of sort of amplifying the basic effects that Africa has on South American rainfall in the first place. In simulations where the entire continent of Africa has been removed, there's much more moisture flowing onto the Amazon and precipitation there. And so what we're finding with the CO2 forcing is it's just sort of amplifying the background effect of Africa on South American rainfall, simply due to the fact that these continents are actually fairly close to one another. And so sort of putting it all together, we were trying to understand what drives different changes in precipitation over the Amazon and other tropical forests, reductions over the Amazon and increases over Indonesia, Malaysia. They both have a reduced evapotranspiration in response to higher CO2. They both produce warmer and drier surface conditions that could potentially act to suppress convection. So that doesn't really explain the differences, and we don't really see what the cause is until we look at the dynamic response, where we have this island-like circulation response over Indonesia, and we have more of a convectively coupled dynamical response over the Amazon that's linked to this dipole pattern with increasing precipitation over the Andes, leading to subsidence over the forest. And a similar dynamical circulation pattern over Africa that leads to a reduction in moisture convergence onto the Amazon, moisture coming from the Atlantic. And so that leads to more moisture in the upper levels converging over Central Africa and in Asia, less moisture converging over the Amazon forest. More of that moisture is transported up the slopes of the Andes, leading to more precipitation there. And this dipole pattern that we see in the Amazon is not just seen in sort of low resolution global models, it's something we've also seen in high resolution, even convective permitting simulations with WRF in response to an instantaneous quadrupling of CO2, where there's this immediate drying and warming and increasing in the height of the boundary layer over the Amazon on sort of a daily timescale, and then on synoptic timescales, this dipole pattern sets up where there's more moisture and moist static energy being exported by the background low-level jet from the Amazon up the slopes of the Andes and contributing to this coupled circulation response there. So even though we're sort of talking about a leaf level effect of reduced stomatal conductance, it's happening over a really big forest over a broad area. It can influence large scale patterns of precipitation over entire continents. And so that's what we've seen there. And now I want to sort of shift gears and think about what happens to the soil, to the moisture in the ground, and how does that influence runoff and flooding. Starting with mean runoff. And so what you see in this picture on the left-hand side are those same average precipitation changes in response to increasing CO2 that we had in the full simulation on the top, in the radiation simulation, and the physiology simulation. And you can see that the mean runoff change in the full simulation largely reflects the changes in, or the pattern of change in precipitation that we see. But here, when we look at the physiology and radiation simulations, it's clear that the physiology is really having a more dominant effect than radiation. Radiation is also leading to warming that can increase evaporative demand and sort of offset changes in precipitation in some places, while physiology cuts off that evaporation and leaves more water in the soil column and can actually contribute even more to increases in runoff. But for flooding impacts, it's not just sort of mean runoff changes that we care about. It's really the intensity of runoff. And so on this next slide, I want to show you the changes in daily runoff and precipitation intensity. This first figure is the change in the 99th percentile daily precipitation rate in the full simulation. And you see sort of widespread increases in the intensity of precipitation, even in models that use parameterized convection. And it's a similar pattern of change in runoff intensity, where there's large increases in the intensity, particularly across Africa and or Central Africa and across Asia and over the Andes. In terms of the precipitation intensity, it's mostly driven by radiative greenhouse effects. So the increases in CO2 in the atmosphere leading to significant intensification of precipitation, with only small contributions due to physiology in particular areas like the Andes and in Indonesia. But when we look at the intensity of runoff, the changes are much more comparable between radiation and physiology, especially at the 99th percentile, where physiology is actually contributing as much as radiation to changes in runoff intensity, and in some cases it's the main factor, especially like over the Andes. And we can sort of collapse these spatial maps into averages of percentile distributions across the tropics. And so that's what you're seeing here. This is an average of the percentile distribution on the x-axis across the tropics between 23 south and 23 north, where we see in the blue line a significant increase in the intensity of precipitation as you go out to the 99th and 99.9th percentile rates. And again, that's mostly driven by radiative effects, with a small contribution due to physiology. But when you look at the same percentile distributions for runoff, which is now shown on the right, you see that physiology is actually playing a larger role out to the 99th percentile. And even out to the 99.9th percentile, physiology is contributing about 1/3 to the changes in daily runoff intensity that are simulated in CESM. And the combined effects of radiation and physiology are nearly a linear combination of the full simulation. So it's clear that it's not just the changes in rainfall intensity that are driving the changes in runoff intensity. It's actually changes in the land surface that also contribute. And again, that has to do with how moisture is being removed from the soil column. This figure again shows you that mean evapotranspiration change due to increasing CO2 in the land surface, which is opposite, especially across the tropics, to much of the change we see due to radiation. So the radiative effects of increasing CO2 increase temperatures and increase evaporative demand, leading to more evaporation, especially in the absence of stomatal conductance, and more total evapotranspiration. And in the full simulation, it's really the physiological part that's controlling what's happening in the tropics. The radiative effects are having a bigger influence when you get into the middle and high latitudes, but across most of the tropics, and in particular across these tropical forest regions, it's the physiological component that's having the biggest effect. And so that leads to increases in the amount of water that stay in the soil, or the soil moisture, and this is showing the total column soil moisture change in the physiological simulation, where we see large increases across the tropics, which again is opposite to some of the changes we see in the radiation simulation, but it's really controlling the changes in soil moisture that we see in the full simulation. And so this is looking at total soil moisture. If we focus on the top 10 centimeters, or the surface soil moisture, which is really sort of the most important infiltration rates in surface runoff, it's even more clear that physiology is contributing to increases in near surface soil moisture, while radiation wants to dry the surface and remove, radiative effects want to dry the surface and remove moisture. And so what this means is when it rains, even if the rainfall rates aren't becoming higher, the amount of moisture in the ground is higher. The ground is already closer to saturation, so more of the rainwater will run off the surface. And I think the best way to visualize that is by looking at the amount of runoff as a function of precipitation rate. And so this figure is showing the runoff conditional amount distribution, where the amount of runoff on the y-axis is a function of precipitation rate. If you look at the red line, which is due to radiative effects, there's this classic signature of rainfall becoming more intense but less frequent, where there's a reduction in the amount of rainfall and the amount of runoff associated with light rainfall rates, and an increase from the amount of runoff associated with heavy rainfall rates. But the full simulation and the physiological simulation have sort of fundamentally different responses. There's increases in runoff associated with all rainfall rates. And so even rainfall rates that may not produce extreme runoff in the present day could produce extreme runoff if the ground is already near saturation in the future as a result of vegetation responses. And so to sort of connect this more directly to flooding impacts and flooding assessments, some work that Meg Fowler has done is to downscale the last 30 years of daily runoff from these simulations using the catchment-based macroscale floodplain model at quarter-degree resolution to yield sort of river discharge estimates at the daily time scale, and then fit annual maxima to a general extreme value distribution to estimate return period. And when you look at the results from this downscaling methodology, you can see that it really aggregates the runoff downstream in major river columns. The figure in the upper right-hand corner is showing you the 99th percentile change in river, or 99th percentile pre-industrial discharge. And if you look at the change in response to the full CO2 forcing affecting both the land and atmosphere, you can see it's highlighting all of these river channels, and in much the same places where the runoff has increased, kind of suggesting that it really is the global scale Earth system model that's driving the changes in that model cascade of flooding assessments. And so you can take the output from the CaMa-Flood model and make these same sort of flood return period changes that I showed you in that first plot at the beginning of the talk. And so here, that's recreated in the picture on the right, and on the left is the change in what is a 100-year flooding event in the pre-industrial climate in response to 4 times CO2 in the full simulation. And you can see that it highlights many of the same regions across the tropics at roughly the same magnitude increases in flood frequency. And then you can do the same thing in the simulations where CO2 has only affected the land surface and where it's only affected the atmosphere, and look at regions where different mechanisms are controlling the changes in runoff intensity that are leading to changes in flood frequency. And so, for example, if you look at sort of the Horn of Africa, you see increases in flood frequency there, that are mostly driven by the radiation simulation. It's an opposite sign in the physiology simulation, while the changes over the Andes are mostly driven by the physiological effect on soil moisture and mean patterns of precipitation, and there's kind of an opposite sign of change due to radiation. And then there are some places, like the southeastern United States, where both the physiological response and the radiative response are contributing to the full change. And those are places that are likely to be the most at risk to future flooding. Those sort of flood return period assessments require complicated and imperfect fits to extreme values, trying to estimate a 100-year flood return period from 30 years of data. But we also see similar effects of physiology in more observable metrics like the mean annual stream flow, the peak stream flow, and low stream flow in each of the sort of major river basins that are represented in the CaMa-Flood model. And so this might open up opportunities for more model validation than you can do by looking at the flood return periods directly. And so to sort of assess the contribution of physiology and radiation to these different metrics of stream flow, we first defined their linearity based on how much the change in physiology plus the change in radiation represents the full change, and really just focused on the river basins where there was a strong linear effect. And these are the results in terms of these three metrics for those river basins that met the criteria for linearity. And you can see the green shows the change due to physiology, the blue is the change due to radiation, the dot is if you add them together, and the star is the full change. And in the tropics, it's really the physiological component that's contributing most to not only changes in peak flow, but also mean and low flow. And in some cases, like the Amazon, the changes can be opposite to what the radiative effects would be alone. Meaning if you're sort of downscaling precipitation and temperature alone without including the land surface effects, you might be missing an important component of what's driving the changes in stream flow. So I've talked about the patterns of precipitation change and how they're affected by vegetation forcing and influences on runoff and flooding. And I just want to sort of briefly touch on some work that's been done looking at how physiological effects can influence drought and temperature extremes as well. In some work done by Abby Swan at the University of Washington, she compared different metrics of drought and how they project drought in the future in response to both radiation and physiological forcing. And if you focus on a sort of atmospheric-centric metric of drought, like the Palmer Drought Index, that depends on precipitation and potential evapotranspiration, you might see widespread increases in drought projected into the future that are contributed to by both plant effects increasing the sensible heating and warming at the surface, and radiation increasing warming around the world, as well as their effects on mean precipitation. But if instead you take into account the fact that evapotranspiration is actually decreasing in many places, even if potential evapotranspiration increases, especially across the tropics, in response to the physiological forcing, and look at a more integrative metric like soil moisture or precipitation minus evaporation, you see the opposite sign of change projected in many places, where some places are where the Palmer Drought Index suggests increases in drought are actually increasing in soil moisture and increasing in runoff. And in some other recent work by Chris Skinner, there's been some evidence showing that vegetation in response to higher CO2 also contributes to heat waves and the total number of heat waves and the intensity of heat waves around the world. This picture shows the change in total heat wave days attributed to the vegetation forcing. And In some regions, that can be up to 20 or 30% of the change in the full simulation. So much smaller than the changes due to radiation alone, but a significant contribution in some places. And here it's just focusing on temperature, but the physiological effects have this sort of competing influence on humidity by reducing evaporative fraction or reducing total evapotranspiration in many places that could lead to reductions in humidity above the surface. And so if you think about something like the heat index or the apparent temperature and the impacts on people, reductions in humidity might partially offset or in some cases reverse the effects of increasing temperature. And so that's something we are starting to look at now. So I think I've gone over time a little bit, but I'll stop here and give you some quick conclusions and questions I'm thinking about going into CMIPS 6. So nearly all CMIP 5 models predict this strengthening zonal precipitation asymmetry across the tropics. Physiology is one of the primary drivers of this change, particularly in dense Asian forests and in the Amazon, due to this physiologically driven dynamical response. These results suggest that the Amazon will potentially receive less rainfall and become more drought prone, while forests in Central Africa and Asia may receive more rainfall and be at more risk for flooding in the future. Plants can influence runoff and flooding impacts both through their feedbacks on the atmosphere and mean precipitation changes, and also through their influence on the soil moisture by directly affecting how much water is evaporating out of the surface. And places where these plant effects are occurring and radiation is driving significant increases in the intensity of precipitation are likely to be at most risk for future flooding. So thinking about CMIP 6, I'm curious about how realistic the representation of these physiological behavior is across different climate models, and if they're becoming more realistic. If updates to land surface models, sort of transitioning from the Ballberry to the Medlin leaf stomatal conductance model, significantly changes the strength of these plant responses and their influence on climate extremes. And also how plant physiological influences on climate extremes might change in models like E3SM that have online river routing and inundation calculations interactively, in models that represent more realistic and intense precipitation, so either going to higher resolution models that can represent convective storms and tropical cyclones more realistically, or superparameterization that permits convection and captures thunderstorms and small-scale storms more realistically. The inclusion of more cloud microphysics and aerosol impacts on cloud processes, the representation of nitrogen limitation or nutrient limitation in land surface models, and sort of thinking about these physiological responses to CO2 alone in the context of more realistic simulations. So not just looking at simulations where CO2 has increased alone, but some of these sort of exclusionary experiments where all other forces are represented, but CO2 physiological effects are removed, and we can sort of see how they contribute to climate changes in the context of all other greenhouse gases and aerosol and land use change as well. So I'll stop there, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot, Gabe. I'm going to end the recording, and then we can take questions.